the summer of 1969, a routine armored van pickup in Brooklyn became the stage for one of the most meticulously planned heists in New York history. Within 12 minutes, $2.8 million in cash vanished without a trace. No arrests were made, no suspects identified, and the case went cold faster than investigators could explain. For 54 years, the truth remained buried in silence. But in 2023, during a routine evidence review at the NYPD's Queens storage facility, a misfiled box containing handwritten notes and a single photograph would crack open a case that had been considered unsolvable. What emerged wasn't just the identity of the mastermind, but proof that his name had been deliberately erased from every official record. The morning of August 14, 1969, started like any other at the First National Bank of Brooklyn Heights. Located on Montague Street, the branch had served the neighborhood for over 2 decades, handling everything from small business deposits to large commercial transactions. That Thursday, the vault contained an unusually high volume of cash due to a delayed Federal Reserve pickup from the previous day. The money sat in reinforced steel containers, waiting for the weekly armored transport that would move it to a secure facility in Manhattan. At exactly 9:47 a.m., a white Brinks armored van pulled up to the service entrance on the building's north side. The timing was precise, routine, and had been followed without variation for nearly 3 years. 2 uniformed guards exited the vehicle and approached the bank's rear door, where they were met by Assistant Manager Robert Kellerman and Head Teller Margaret Finn. Both employees had been with the bank for over 5 years and were familiar with the weekly procedure. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The transfer began as scheduled. 6 steel containers, each weighing approximately 40 pounds and secured with dual locks, were wheeled from the vault to the loading area. The guards verified the manifest, checked the seals, and began the careful process of loading each container into the van's reinforced cargo area. Standard protocol required both guards to remain with the vehicle at all times, but on this particular morning, a deviation occurred that would prove fatal to the operation's security. At 9:52 a.m., as the loading neared completion, a delivery truck blocked the narrow alley behind the bank. The driver, apparently confused about his destination, had stopped directly behind the Brinks van, making it impossible for the armored vehicle to back out. One of the guards, James Morrison, walked over to speak with the delivery driver about moving the truck. This left his partner, Carl Hendricks, alone with the partially loaded van for approximately 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, everything changed. What happened next was captured in fragments by witnesses, but the full picture wouldn't emerge for over half a century. From the bank's side entrance, 3 men approached the van. They wore identical dark blue coveralls with patches that resembled utility company uniforms. Each carried a clipboard and moved with the casual confidence of workers conducting routine business. To anyone observing from a distance, they appeared to be conducting an inspection or maintenance check. Hendricks, focused on securing the final container, didn't notice the men until they were within 10 feet of the van. When he looked up, one of them was already speaking to him, gesturing toward the vehicle's rear axle and pointing to something underneath. The man's tone was professional, urgent but not alarming. He explained that they had received a report about a possible hydraulic leak and needed to conduct a quick inspection before the vehicle could safely proceed. The explanation was plausible enough. Armored vehicles were complex machines, and mechanical issues were not uncommon. Hendricks had been trained to prioritize safety and to cooperate with authorized personnel when necessary. The man produced what appeared to be a work order, complete with official-looking stamps and signatures. Everything seemed legitimate. What Hendricks didn't know was that the delivery truck blocking the alley wasn't lost. It was positioned there deliberately, timed to coincide with the exact moment when the van would be most vulnerable. The three men weren't utility workers conducting an inspection. They were part of a carefully orchestrated team that had been studying the bank's security procedures for months. As Hendricks bent down to examine the supposed leak, the lead man struck him behind the neck with a weighted leather sap. The blow was precise, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Hendricks collapsed immediately, conscious but unable to move or call for help. The second man quickly applied restraints around his wrists and ankles, while the third began moving the steel containers from the van to the delivery truck. The transfer took exactly 4 minutes. The containers were heavy, but the men worked with practiced efficiency, using a wheeled dolly to move each one quickly and quietly. There was no shouting, no panic, no wasted motion. Everything had been rehearsed down to the smallest detail. Meanwhile, Morrison continued his conversation with the delivery truck driver, unaware that his partner was being overpowered just 30 feet away. The driver, later identified as Vincent Torino, kept Morrison engaged with questions about directions and local traffic patterns. Torino appeared genuinely confused and apologetic about blocking the alley, even offering to buy Morrison coffee as compensation for the inconvenience. By the time Morrison realized something was wrong, the three men had vanished. The delivery truck was gone. The steel containers were missing, and Hendricks lay bound and dazed in the back of the empty armored van. The entire operation had lasted less than 12 minutes from start to finish. The immediate response was swift but ultimately fruitless. Morrison activated his radio and called for backup while simultaneously alerting the bank's security system. Within minutes, police units flooded the area, sealing off a 6-block radius and establishing checkpoints at major intersections. The delivery truck was spotted heading toward the Brooklyn Bridge, but by the time units reached the bridge, it had vanished into the heavy morning traffic. A citywide alert was issued, but the trail had already gone cold. The truck, later found abandoned in a parking garage in Lower Manhattan, had been thoroughly cleaned and stripped of any identifying evidence. The license plates were fake, the VIN number had been filed off, and the interior had been wiped down with industrial solvent. Even the tire tracks at the scene proved useless, as the truck had been fitted with common commercial tires that could be found on thousands of similar vehicles throughout the city. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, but yielded few concrete leads. Detectives interviewed dozens of bank employees, armored car personnel, and local business owners. They canvassed the neighborhood, reviewed traffic patterns, and analyzed the timing of the heist down to the second. The conclusion was disturbing. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a precisely planned operation that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the bank's security procedures and the armored car company's schedule. The theft had been executed with such professional precision that investigators suspected it was the work of experienced criminals, possibly with military or law enforcement backgrounds. The use of realistic disguises, the timing of the distraction, and the coordinated movements all pointed to a level of planning that exceeded typical street-level crime. Yet, despite months of investigation, no arrests were made. The case file grew thick with witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative theories, but solid evidence remained elusive. The three men had left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no traceable connections to the crime scene. The disguises they wore were generic enough to be purchased anywhere, and the tools they used were common items available at any hardware store. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of any attempt to fence the stolen money. In 1969, moving that volume of cash without detection required connections to organized crime networks, underground banks, or international money laundering operations. Yet none of the usual suspects showed signs of sudden wealth or increased activity. The money had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Internal memos from the NYPD's robbery division, declassified decades later, revealed the frustration of investigators who suspected they were dealing with something beyond ordinary criminal enterprise. The heist bore the hallmarks of professional intelligence work, with the layers of misdirection and contingency planning that suggested extensive resources and expertise. Detective Lieutenant Frank Castellano, who led the investigation, wrote in his final report that the case represented a new level of criminal sophistication that challenges traditional investigative methods. He noted that the perpetrators had not only avoided detection during the crime, but had also managed to conceal their identities so thoroughly that no viable suspects had emerged even after intensive investigation. The case was officially suspended in 1972, though it was never formally closed. The stolen money was written off by the insurance company, and the bank implemented new security protocols designed to prevent similar incidents. But within the department, the Brooklyn armored van heist became a cautionary tale about the evolution of criminal methods and the limitations of conventional police work. For over 5 decades, the case remained dormant, filed away in boxes that moved from precinct to precinct as the NYPD reorganized its storage systems. The physical evidence was preserved, but the institutional memory began to fade as the original investigators retired or passed away. By the 2020s, the case existed primarily as a historical footnote, referenced occasionally in training materials but no longer actively pursued. That changed in the spring of 2023, when a routine evidence audit at the NYPD's Queens storage facility uncovered a misfiled box containing materials that had never been properly cataloged. Among the contents was a manila envelope marked with a date from 1969 and a case number that matched the Brooklyn armored van heist. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note that would fundamentally alter the understanding of the case. The photograph showed a man in his 30s, well-dressed and confident, standing next to what appeared to be a construction site. The handwriting on the back was faded but legible. TM, Site Supervisor, August 1969. The accompanying note, written in a different hand, contained a name that had never appeared in any official report: Thomas Malone. The discovery triggered an immediate review of the original case files. Detectives combed through witness statements, suspect lists, and investigative notes, searching for any mention of Thomas Malone. They found nothing. It was as if the name had been systematically removed from every document, every interview transcript, every piece of evidence connected to the case. The implications were staggering. If Thomas Malone had been involved in the heist, why had his name been erased from the records? Who had the authority to make such alterations? And what had happened to the missing documentation that would have explained his connection to the crime? The photograph itself raised additional questions. The construction site in the background appeared to be in an early stage of development, with steel framework and concrete foundations visible. The timestamp on the back placed it in August 1969, the same month as the heist. But what was the connection between a construction supervisor and an armored van robbery? As investigators began to piece together the implications of the discovery, they realized they weren't just dealing with a cold case. They were confronting evidence of a deliberate cover-up that had successfully concealed the truth for over 50 years. The question was no longer just who had committed the crime, but who had possessed the power and motivation to erase all traces of the real mastermind. The discovery of Thomas Malone's name in that forgotten box would prove to be the first crack in a wall of silence that had protected one of the most successful heists in American history. What lay behind that wall was a story of corruption, conspiracy, and carefully orchestrated deception that reached far beyond a simple armored van robbery. The search for Thomas Malone began with the most basic investigative tools available in 2023. Detective Sarah Chen, assigned to the Cold Case Unit, started with digital records that hadn't existed in 1969, Social Security databases, employment records, and city permits all drew blanks. There was no Thomas Malone matching the age and description from the photograph anywhere in the system. It was as if the man had never existed, but the photograph was real. The handwriting was authentic, and the construction site in the background provided the first tangible lead in over 5 decades. Chen enlarged the image and studied every detail. The steel framework suggested a major commercial project, and the concrete work appeared to be foundation level. This wasn't a small residential job. It was significant construction that would have required permits, inspections, and extensive documentation. Working with the city's Department of Buildings, Chen cross-referenced every major construction project that had been active in August 1969. The list was surprisingly short. Brooklyn was experiencing a construction boom, but only a handful of projects matched the scale and timeline visible in the photograph. One stood out immediately: the construction of a new office complex on Atlantic Avenue, less than 2 miles from the First National Bank. The Atlantic Avenue project had been controversial from the start. Residents had opposed the demolition of historic brownstones to make way for a modern office building. The developer, Meridian Construction Corporation, had pushed through the permits despite community protests. The project had been fast-tracked through the approval process, with construction beginning in June 1969 and scheduled for completion by the end of the year. Chen requested the original building permits and construction records from the city archives. The paperwork was yellowed and brittle, but it was complete. The site supervisor listed on the permits was Thomas Malone, employed by Meridian Construction Corporation. His signature appeared on dozens of documents, from safety inspections to material delivery receipts. The handwriting matched the note found in the evidence box. The discovery confirmed what Chen had suspected. Thomas Malone was not just real, he was a central figure in a major construction project happening simultaneously with the armored van heist. But his name had been completely scrubbed from the police investigation. Someone with significant authority had made sure that connection was never made. Chen dug deeper into Meridian Construction Corporation. The company had been founded in 1967 by Vincent Torino, the same man who had driven the delivery truck that blocked the armored van's escape route. The connection was impossible to ignore. The distraction that had separated the 2 guards wasn't random. It was part of a coordinated plan that involved both the construction company and its site supervisor. The pieces began falling into place. Torino hadn't been an innocent delivery driver confused about directions. He had been part of the heist team, using his legitimate business as cover for the operation. His construction company provided the perfect front for planning and logistics. Workers moved freely through the city. Delivery trucks were commonplace, and construction sites offered secure locations for meetings and equipment storage. But if Torino was involved, why hadn't his name been erased from the records like Malone's? Chen reviewed the original witness statements and found the answer. Torino had been interviewed by police, but only as a witness. He had played his role perfectly, appearing frustrated and apologetic about blocking the alley. His story had been consistent and believable. The investigators had cleared him without suspicion. Malone, however, represented a different kind of threat. As site supervisor, he would have had access to detailed knowledge about security procedures, timing, and logistics. His involvement would have elevated the case from a simple robbery to something far more complex. If his connection to the heist had been discovered, it would have exposed the entire network behind the operation. The deliberate erasure of Malone's name suggested that someone with significant influence had intervened to protect him. But who had that kind of power? And why had they chosen to sacrifice the investigation to shield one man? Chen's investigation took on new urgency as she realized the implications. This wasn't just about solving a 50-year-old robbery. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that had corrupted the original investigation and allowed the perpetrators to escape justice. The evidence suggested that someone within the system had actively worked to conceal the truth. The breakthrough came when Chen discovered that Meridian Construction Corporation had been awarded several lucrative city contracts in the months following the heist. The company had suddenly become a preferred contractor for municipal projects, despite having little prior experience with government work. The timing was suspicious, and the contracts were worth millions of dollars. A pattern emerged. Torino's construction company had received preferential treatment from the city, while Malone's identity had been protected from police investigation. Someone with influence over both the construction industry and the law enforcement had orchestrated a cover-up that benefited both men. The question was, who had possessed that kind of power in 1969? The answer lay in the political landscape of the time. Brooklyn's construction industry was heavily influenced by local political machines that controlled contracts, permits, and regulatory oversight. The same networks that could fast-track building permits could also influence police investigations. If the heist had been planned by someone with connections to these power structures, it would explain both the sophisticated execution and the subsequent cover-up. Chen began researching the political figures who had been active in Brooklyn construction during 1969. The list included city council members, planning commissioners, and various bureaucrats who controlled the permitting process. One name appeared repeatedly in connection with both Meridian Construction and the police department: Deputy Commissioner Michael Brennan. Brennan had been a rising star in the NYPD hierarchy, known for his close relationships with construction industry leaders and his ability to navigate complex political situations. He had been personally involved in several high-profile cases during the late 1960s, including the investigation of the armored van heist. His signature appeared on multiple documents related to the case, including evidence transfers and witness interview schedules. The connection between Brennan and Torino's construction company was documented in city records. Brennan had served on the committee that awarded municipal contracts, and he had been a vocal supporter of the Atlantic Avenue project despite community opposition. His influence had been instrumental in securing the fast-track approval that allowed construction to begin ahead of schedule. If Brennan had been involved in planning the heist, it would explain everything. His position within the police department gave him access to security procedures and investigation protocols. His connections to the construction industry provided the perfect cover for operational planning, and his political influence allowed him to manipulate the investigation to protect his co-conspirators. The realization that a high-ranking police official might have orchestrated the robbery sent shockwaves through the cold case unit. It represented a level of corruption that challenged fundamental assumptions about law enforcement integrity. But the evidence was mounting, and Chen couldn't ignore the pattern of connections that all pointed to Brennan. The investigation took on a new dimension, as Chen realized she was dealing with more than a simple theft. She was uncovering evidence of systemic corruption that had allowed criminals to operate with impunity while using their positions of authority to cover their tracks. The armored van heist hadn't been solved because the people responsible for solving it had been the ones who committed it. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as Chen examined the aftermath of the heist. The money had never been recovered, but several individuals connected to the case had experienced sudden improvements in their financial situations. Torino's construction company had expanded rapidly, winning contracts worth millions of dollars. Brennan had been promoted within the department and had invested in real estate that appreciated significantly over the following years. Even more disturbing was the pattern of witness intimidation that had occurred during the original investigation. Several potential witnesses had changed their stories or refused to cooperate with police. Others had left the city entirely, claiming they feared for their safety. The systematic suppression of evidence hadn't been accidental. It had been orchestrated by someone with the authority to control the investigation's direction. The photograph of Thomas Malone represented the one piece of evidence that had escaped the cover-up. It had been misfiled, forgotten, and lost in the bureaucratic shuffle that followed decades of departmental reorganization. But its discovery had opened a window into a conspiracy that had successfully concealed the truth for over 50 years. Chen's investigation was far from over. She had identified the key players and understood the basic structure of the conspiracy, but proving it would require more than circumstantial evidence. The original participants were long dead, and many of the records had been destroyed or lost. But the photograph had provided a starting point, and Chen was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. The case had evolved from a simple robbery investigation into something much more complex. It was now about justice deferred, truth concealed, and the corrupting influence of power. The $2.8 million that had vanished in 1969 was just the beginning. The real crime was the systematic betrayal of public trust that had allowed the perpetrators to escape accountability. As Chen prepared to dig deeper into the conspiracy, she knew she was entering dangerous territory. The people who had orchestrated the cover-up had possessed significant power, and their influence might still extend into the present. But the discovery of Thomas Malone's name had cracked open a case that had been considered unsolvable. Now it was time to see what other secrets had been buried in the silence of half a century. The investigation was about to reveal connections that reached far beyond Brooklyn, touching networks of corruption that had shaped the city's development for decades. The armored van heist had been just one operation in a larger pattern of criminal activity that had been protected by those sworn to prevent it. The truth was finally beginning to emerge, and it was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The deeper Chen dug into Deputy Commissioner Michael Brennan's background, the more disturbing the picture became. Brennan hadn't just been a corrupt official skimming money from construction contracts. He had been the architect of an entire criminal network that operated under the protection of his badge. The armored van heist had been his masterpiece, a carefully orchestrated operation that demonstrated just how completely he had corrupted the system meant to stop him. Financial records from the early 1970s painted a clear picture of Brennan's sudden wealth. His salary as a deputy commissioner was modest, but his lifestyle suggested access to significant additional income. He had purchased a waterfront property in the Hamptons, invested in multiple commercial real estate ventures, and funded his children's expensive private school educations. When questioned about his finances during routine departmental reviews, Brennan had attributed his success to wise investments and family inheritance. No one had pressed for details. The construction contracts awarded to Torino's company told an even more compelling story. Between 1969 and 1975, Meridian Construction Corporation had won bids on 17 major city projects, despite consistently submitting proposals that were neither the lowest nor the most qualified. The contracts had been worth over $40 million in total, providing more than enough revenue to justify the risk of the armored van operation. Chen discovered that Brennan had served on the evaluation committees for 14 of those 17 contracts. His influence had been decisive in each case, and his justifications for selecting Meridian had been documented in committee minutes that revealed a pattern of favoritism that bordered on the absurd. Torino's company had been chosen for projects they were clearly unqualified to handle. Yet somehow they had completed each job without significant problems. The explanation lay in the network of subcontractors and suppliers that Brennan had helped arrange. Legitimate construction companies had done the actual work, while Meridian had served as a front that skimmed profits from each project. The system had been elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Taxpayer money had been systematically diverted to fund a criminal enterprise that operated with complete impunity. Thomas Malone's role in the network became clearer as Chen traced his employment history beyond the Atlantic Avenue project. He had worked as site supervisor on 11 of the 17 contracts awarded to Meridian, moving from project to project with remarkable consistency. His expertise hadn't been in construction management but in logistics and security. He had been Brennan's field coordinator, the man who ensured that each operation ran smoothly and left no traceable evidence. The sophistication of the network explained why the armored van heist had been executed with such precision. It hadn't been a one-time criminal venture, but rather the culmination of years of planning and preparation. Brennan had used his position to study security procedures, timing, and vulnerabilities. Torino had provided the operational cover and equipment. Malone had coordinated the details and managed the execution. Together, they had created a criminal enterprise that operated more efficiently than many legitimate businesses. The cover-up that followed the heist had been equally impressive. Brennan had personally overseen the evidence collection, ensuring that crucial items were misfiled or lost. He had directed the witness interviews, making certain that questions weren't asked that might lead to uncomfortable answers. He had controlled the flow of information to federal agencies, preventing outside oversight that might have exposed the conspiracy. Most importantly, Brennan had managed the narrative that emerged from the investigation. The official story portrayed the heist as the work of sophisticated outsiders, possibly with connections to organized crime. The focus had been placed on external threats rather than internal corruption. The media had accepted this narrative without question, and the public had never suspected that the police department itself had been compromised. The systematic erasure of Malone's name from the records represented the most chilling aspect of the cover-up. Brennan had possessed the authority to alter official documents, remove evidence from files, and instruct subordinates to forget information they had uncovered. The original investigators had been following orders when they failed to pursue obvious leads. They hadn't been incompetent. They had been deliberately misdirected by their superior. Chen's investigation revealed that at least 6 detectives had raised questions about inconsistencies in the case during the original investigation. Their concerns had been documented in internal memos that expressed frustration with the limited scope of the inquiry. One detective had specifically requested permission to investigate construction companies operating near the bank. Another had wanted to examine the financial records of city contractors. All of these requests had been denied by Brennan personally. The pattern of obstruction had been so systematic that it couldn't have been accidental. Brennan had known exactly which lines of inquiry to shut down because he had known what they would uncover. His control over the investigation had been absolute, and his ability to manipulate the evidence had been unquestioned. The original detectives had been investigating a case that their own superior had committed. The discovery of additional misfiled documents in the evidence storage facility provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Hidden in boxes that had been incorrectly labeled and forgotten for decades, Chen found photographs, witness statements, and financial records that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. The evidence had been preserved by accident, saved from destruction by the same bureaucratic incompetence that had allowed it to be hidden in the first place. Among the recovered documents was a handwritten note from Brennan to Malone, dated 3 days before the heist. The message was brief but unmistakable. Thursday morning confirmed. Vehicle route unchanged. Security protocols verified. Proceed as planned. The note was written on official NYPD letterhead and bore Brennan's distinctive signature. It was direct evidence of his involvement in planning the robbery. Another document revealed the method used to launder the stolen money. The $2.8 million had been divided into smaller amounts and channeled through the construction contracts over a period of several years. False invoices, inflated material costs, and phantom subcontractor payments had allowed the money to be integrated into the legitimate economy without raising suspicion. The scheme had been so sophisticated that it had escaped detection even during the routine audits. The recovered evidence also included photographs of meetings between Brennan, Torino, and Malone at various construction sites around the city. The images had been taken by an unknown surveillance team, possibly federal agents who had been investigating construction industry corruption independently. The photographs showed the three men examining blueprints, discussing documents, and clearly operating as a coordinated team. Most damning of all was a financial ledger that documented the distribution of profits from the various construction contracts. The entries showed regular payments to Brennan, with amounts that corresponded to his known expenditures on real estate and investments. The ledger also listed payments to several other individuals, including police officers, city officials, and construction industry insiders. The corruption had extended far beyond the original three conspirators. The scope of the network explained why the cover-up had been so successful. Brennan hadn't been acting alone. He had been part of a larger system of corruption that included dozens of individuals in positions of authority. The armored van heist had been just one operation in a criminal enterprise that had systematically looted the city's treasury for years. As Chen compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, she realized that the case represented more than just a successful robbery. It was evidence of institutional failure on a massive scale. The systems designed to prevent corruption had been corrupted themselves. The people responsible for protecting the public had become the primary threat to public safety. The implications extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The construction projects funded by stolen money had shaped Brooklyn's development for decades. Buildings still standing today had been financed through criminal enterprise. The city's infrastructure bore the hidden marks of corruption that had operated with complete impunity. The legal challenges of prosecuting a 50-year-old case were significant, but Chen's investigation had achieved something more important than criminal convictions. It had exposed the truth about a crime that had been deliberately concealed. The victims of the heist had been more than just the armored car company and its insurers. The real victims had been the citizens of Brooklyn, who had been systematically robbed by the people they had trusted to protect them. The discovery of Thomas Malone's name in that forgotten evidence box had accomplished what decades of investigation had failed to achieve. It had cracked open a conspiracy that had successfully hidden the truth for over half a century. The photograph and handwritten note had been preserved by chance, saved from destruction by the same bureaucratic chaos that had allowed the original cover-up to succeed. In her final report, Chen noted that the case demonstrated both the persistence of evidence and the power of time to reveal hidden truths. The conspirators had believed they had successfully erased all traces of their crimes, but they had underestimated the ability of physical evidence to survive even the most determined attempts at concealment. The misfiled box had been their undoing, a random archive that had preserved their secrets until someone finally discovered them. The Brooklyn armored van heist of 1969 was officially closed in 2023, not through arrests or convictions, but through the revelation of truth that had been hidden for 54 years. The $2.8 million was never recovered, but something more valuable had been found. Proof that justice, however delayed, could still be served. The name that had been erased from the records was finally restored, and the conspiracy that had protected it was finally exposed. The case served as a reminder that corruption, no matter how carefully concealed, leaves traces that can survive for decades. The truth has a way of emerging, even when those in power have done everything possible to bury it. Thomas Malone's name had been deliberately erased from history, but history had found a way to remember.